That was the first time for me that I'd really smoked marijuana. And I left, and I left, and I left.
Then we were smoking marijuana for breakfast at that period, and we were well into marijuana, and nobody could communicate with us because it was just four glazed eyes giggling all the time, you know, in their own world.
Well, I think, you know, this was beginning to get into that period when people were sort of giving up the drink, which had been the sort of stimulant of the times, and were getting into the herbal jazz cigarettes. And it was changing things a bit, you know, things were becoming a bit more imaginative, a little more crazy.
In high society, high society, high society, high society, high society.
Hello and welcome to another edition of High Society. My name is David Malmo-Levine, I'm your host, and today with us for this special swingin' 60s edition of High Society we have Marijuana Man in the studio.
Hey everybody, good to see y'all again.
And on today's show we're going to be looking at some clips from the swingin' 60s. We have some clips with Bobby Dylan and introducing the marijuana to the Beatles.
Yes.
And we have lots of clips of the Beatles talking about their marijuana experiences. We have a little bit of Jimi Hendrix, him talking about being stoned and shooting the shit with some young folks. And then we have a special off the Dazed and Confused flashback edition, The Blunt Truth, which is kind of, I think, a little joke public service announcement type thing they had made there. What do you think of some of these clips you saw?
Well, it was a lot of fun to look at them. I think David chose me because I'm the oldest guy around, and I was actually there during those years. Sure didn't know a lot of that was going on behind the scenes. It wasn't very evident in the public. But the clips that David's found here are quite funny, a lot of them, and quite telling, a lot of them too. Yeah,
you had to suspect that the Beatles were at least using, you know, LSD occasionally or something. Sgt. Pepper came out with tangerine trees and marmalade skies.
As teenagers, we all were. Maybe, I don't know, back in 1967 when Sgt. Pepper's came out, we probably weren't all doing LSD, but some people were.
Yeah.
Maybe not in my crew, but it wasn't too long after that we all were doing LSD, but I think they probably got access to it a little sooner than the masses did.
Yeah.
Now, whether or not it affected, I don't know, it certainly affected their music and it affected everything. No question about it.
The thing I learned about the Beatles when I started doing this research, I had no idea they were so active, even in the 60s. And July 24th, 67, Paul McCartney and John Lennon added their names to a full-page ad in the London Times calling for an end to the prohibition of cannabis. And then later on, in 1969, December 22nd, I think it was, John Lennon actually testified at the Ledane Commission. He said something to the effect of, we know how to solve Britain's problems, ha-ha, to allow... to legalize marijuana and allow homosexuals to marry, and Britain would be the richest country in the world. It's as simple as that, he said.
Who would have thought?
Who would have thought?
Well, they ignored the Ledane Commission and they ignored John Lennon.
Well, they didn't totally ignore him. I do believe he went to this concert, or appeared and performed at this concert on behalf of John Sinclair, a White Panther and a marijuana organizer who was in jail for 2 joints. They gave him 10 years for 2 joints. So John Lennon wrote this song on his behalf. They gave him 10 for 2. But and we'll publish the actual lyrics to this song and a link that you can hear John Lennon singing this song in the information box below. But
and I don't know, John Sinclair is actually a real person still, and is active, and he's got a radio program out there on the internet.
Right.
John Sinclair I don't know. You can Google it and find it.
We'll find it for you. We'll put the information at the box. But what I saw was on the movie Grass, you hear the first part of the song, but you don't hear the last part of the song. The last part of the song, John Lennon's talking about the CIA pushing drugs in it, and that he's just in jail for representing everybody. And so it's a really deep song. We'll publish the entire lyrics for you, and we're going to have some amazing clips of the Beatles coming up right now.
But in the new rollicking sound and cryptic lyrics, many saw the influence of drugs.
People in the mid-'60s would listen to Dylan albums and try to decode them. Often people did this listening stoned, and often assuming that Dylan was also, or might just as well be, and that if you were stoned, you somehow got the connections that were otherwise opaque.
Those less sympathetic to drug use singled out the song Mr. Tambourine Man, charging that it explicitly encouraged getting stoned.
Take me on a trip upon your magic swirling ship. My senses have been stripped. My hands can't feel to grip. My toes too numb to step. Wait only for my boot heels to be wandering.
I don't think that's the kind of stuff you come up with if you're just eating grape nuts. I think you need something a little more mind-expanding to come up with this material, and, you know, for some part, maybe you need it to understand it.
Dylan denied the influence of drugs on his songwriting, but told a journalist that he saw nothing wrong with opium and marijuana. Those things aren't drugs, he claimed. They just bend your mind a little. I think everybody's mind should be bent once in a while. One set of minds he helped to bend were those of the Beatles. Dylan first introduced the Beatles to marijuana, and the Fab Four would later credit Dylan's lyrics with helping them move from their early teeny bopper sound to the moodier introspection of albums like Rubber Soul and Revolver.
So Bob, he always, at the time, he was poo-pooing the Beatles as bubblegum.
But Beatlemania had made its mark on Dylan as well. Years later, he would admit, "I knew they were pointing the direction that music had to go."
Because his lyrics influenced John to talk about himself, to talk about personal things in his lyrics. And their sound helped Bob go electric.
I mean, I heard of Bob through John. He played the records to me, and it was just great.
I think it was freewheeling.
We love Bob Dylan.
I saw 10,000 talkers whose tongues were all broken. I saw guns and sharp swords in the hands of young children. And it's hard, and it's hard, and it's hard, and it's hard, and it's hard rains are gonna fall.
So when we met him, by that time we'd heard much more of him and knew much more about him.
It was a great honour to meet him. We had a crazy party the night we met. I went around, I thought I got the meaning to life that night. And I went around trying to find our roadie. Mal, get a pencil and a paper. I've got it. And Mal, because we're a bit out of it, he couldn't find a pencil and paper anywhere. But eventually, in the end of the evening, he found it, and I wrote down my message for the universe, I said, now keep that in your pocket. And Mal did. The next morning, he said, "Hey, Paul," he said, "do you want to see that?" I said, "What?" He said, "A bit of paper." "Oh, yeah." And I'd written, "There are 7 levels."
Well, there was 2 men in the room, and Bob's the well-known one.
Al Aronowitz was there. He was a journalist. He was like a mate.
That was the first time for me that I'd really smoked marijuana. And I left, and I left, and I left. It was fabulous.
For the times they are a-changing.
Boys, are you buzzing?
Well, I think, this was beginning to get into that period when people were sort of giving up the drink, which had been the sort of stimulant of the times, and we're getting into the herbal jazz cigarettes. And it was changing things a bit, you know, things were becoming a bit more imaginative, a little more crazy.